What happens when a single, catastrophic mistake destroys everything you've carefully built? Your reputation, your livelihood, your carefully maintained invisibility. But in the wreckage of that destruction, you find the one thing you never even knew you were missing. What if the worst moment of your life was actually the universe, tired of waiting, finally forcing your hand? Pay close attention to the young woman you see right now, the one in the gray uniform, the one whose trembling hands are losing their grip on that silver tray. Watch the dark, steaming coffee arc through the air in slow motion. Watch it hit that pristine white cufflink like a judgment from the heavens. Watch her face, because in this moment she genuinely believes her world is ending. Her eyes are wide, her breath is locked in her chest, and every single nightmare she has ever had about this exact scenario is happening in real time. Now look at the man she has just spilled coffee on. Really look at him. His name is Kelechi Okafor. He is 34 years old. He controls 3 of the 5 largest telecommunications networks in West Africa. His company, Okafortel, is worth $11 billion, American dollars, not naira, and that valuation was from last quarter's conservative estimate. He has been featured on the cover of Forbes Africa 4 times. He has had dinners with presidents and breakfasts with kings. He has broken men twice his age by simply refusing to return their calls. In the boardroom, they don't call him difficult or demanding. They call him inevitable. Because when Kelechi Okafor decides something will happen, it happens. When he decides something won't happen, it doesn't. Simple as that. And right now, this man, this towering, terrifying force of Lagos industry, is rising from his seat with a fury so cold and absolute that everyone else in the room has physically leaned backward in their chairs. He grabs her wrist. The force of it snaps the small plastic button off her sleeve. The cheap gray fabric peels back, and on the inside of her wrist, against her dark skin, is a birthmark shaped like a jagged 5-pointed star. Watch what happens to his face. Watch the fury drain from it like water from a cracked vessel. Watch his eyes, those eyes that have reduced grown men to apologies, go wide, then glassy, then overwhelmed with something that is not anger at all. Something that looks impossibly like grief, like relief, like 25 years of a wound finally beginning to close. Watch Kelechi Okafor, the most powerful man in the room, the most feared businessman in West Africa, the man whose knees have never bent for anyone, collapse straight down into the puddle of spilled coffee, his bespoke charcoal suit soaking through, his eyes never leaving her wrist. He didn't drop to his knees in anger. He dropped to his knees because the clumsy maid standing above him, confused, terrified, waiting to be fired or arrested or both, was carrying the one thing his $11 billion had never been able to buy. Stay with me, because this story doesn't begin in this boardroom. It begins in a place so different from Banana Island that calling them the same city almost feels like a lie. To understand Zainab Adisa, you first have to understand what it means to grow up invisible. Not invisible the way the wealthy sometimes joke about wanting to be, not the comfortable anonymity of someone who chooses when they are seen and when they are not. The kind of invisibility Zainab grew up being was the kind that happens to you, the kind that is imposed. The invisibility of a person whom the world has decided it does not need to look at, does not need to account for, does not owe anything to. She was 23 years old when the coffee incident happened, and every single one of those 23 years had been a masterclass in how to exist without taking up too much space.
She had been born in Ajegunle, not the sanitized, redeveloped edges of Ajegunle that sometimes appear in architecture magazines celebrating Lagos's transformation, but the deep interior of it, where the roads end and the structures begin, where zinc rooftops press so close together that sunlight arrives at street level as something narrow and apologetic, like a visitor unsure of its welcome. Her mother, Amira Adisa, had been a seamstress. A good one, actually. Her fingers were extraordinary. Her eye for pattern and proportion was something almost mystical. She could look at a woman and calculate her measurements without a tape, could copy a European fashion magazine photograph into a wearable garment using market-bought fabric that cost a fraction of the original. If life had been different, if she had been born in a different part of this same city, with access to the right training and the right people, she might have been a designer. She might have had a name. Instead, she had a tiny stall and a steady stream of neighborhood customers. And for the first 4 years of Zainab's life, it was enough. Barely enough, but enough. Zainab's father was a man she knew only from a single photograph and her mother's carefully rationed stories. He had been a trader, fabric mostly, which is how he met Amira, and he had died of a treatable illness made fatal by the simple absence of money. He was 27 years old. Zainab was 2. By the time Zainab was 6, it was just the 2 of them against the compound, her mother, her mother's sewing machine, and Zainab, who learned very early that the best way to stay out of trouble was to stay out of sight. She was a quiet child, observant. She watched people with an intensity that made adults uncomfortable, like she was memorizing them, cataloging them against some future need. The birthmark had been a source of torment almost from the moment she became aware of it. It was on her right wrist, just below where the pulse beats, a jagged star, sharp-edged and distinct, like something drawn with a confident hand. Dark against dark, but noticeable up close, undeniably there. Her mother used to trace it sometimes when she thought Zainab was asleep, her seamstress's fingers gentle on the raised skin, her lips moving in something that might have been a prayer or might have been a memory. "It's special," her mother told her, the few times Zainab asked. "It means you belong to something bigger than this." Children in the compound did not agree. Children in primary school did not agree. She was teased for it, the way children find anything different and sharpen it into a weapon. Aja, they called her sometimes, marked one, witch girl. She learned to keep her sleeve pulled down. She learned to hide. Her mother died when Zainab was 11. Fever, then complications, then the grim arithmetic of a public hospital system stretched far past its limits. She was there. She held her mother's hand through the final hours, this small, serious girl in a school uniform, sitting very still in a plastic hospital chair, understanding in some bone-deep way that the world was rearranging itself around her and nothing would ever be the same again. She was right. The years that followed were years of movement, from one relative's home to another, from one uncomfortable tolerance to the next. She was not ill-treated exactly, not by anyone she could point to and name, but she was also never wanted, not really, and a child always knows the difference. She was the extra mouth, the obligation, the problem that had arrived uninvited and showed no signs of leaving. She was fed and clothed and sent to school when it was convenient, and she learned to ask for nothing, to be grateful for whatever arrived, to make herself small enough that her presence never tipped the scales toward resentment. She was 16 when she got her first real job, helping at a catering company that supplied events around Victoria Island. She was fast and neat and utterly reliable, and by 18 she had saved enough to rent a room, a real room, her own room, in a shared apartment in Yaba, and the pride she felt standing in that tiny, damp, near-windowless space was something she would remember for the rest of her life. She worked 3 jobs simultaneously for most of her 19th and 20th years. Catering on weekends, cleaning offices weekday mornings, a brief and physically punishing stint at a textile factory that she quit after 4 months when a machine nearly took 2 of her fingers. She was relentlessly disciplined, methodical with money in the way that people who have been hungry become, not stingy, but precise. Every naira was accounted for, every expenditure was deliberate. She had applied to the Okafor estate through an agency when she was 22. The pay was exceptional by household standards, nearly double what she had been making, and the position came with accommodation, which meant she could save even more. She knew the name, of course. Everyone in Lagos knew the name.
Kelechi Okafor was the second kind. He had the cover stories and the conference invitations and the portfolio that made grown men envious to the point of irrationality. He had the mansion and the motorcade and the tailored suits that cost more than most people's monthly salaries. He had all of it. And underneath all of it, wrapped in enough ambition and discipline to look almost like healing, was a boy who had been alone in ways that most people could not fully comprehend. He had been born in Makoko, not the Makoko of artistic photography or documentary filmmaking or architectural study, the floating settlement that journalists from overseas find so visually arresting, the stilt houses and the narrow waterways and the children who grow up learning to navigate a world built on water. He had been born in the part of Makoko that is just poor, the interior part, the part where the water quality is terrible and the air quality is not much better, and the sound of children crying at night is indistinguishable from the sound of adults doing the same. His mother had died in childbirth. His father had been present for approximately the first 2 years of his life before disappearing into whatever it is that some men disappear into when the weight of reality becomes too much. Kelechi did not remember him. He did not spend much time trying to. He had been raised loosely by a neighbor, a woman named Mama Bisi who had 8 children of her own and whose capacity for additional human beings in her care was heroic but not unlimited. He was fed. He was not beaten. These were the benchmarks of his early childhood, and he had not known for a long time that other children's benchmarks were higher. He had been a small child, not sickly but small, lean and watchful, with eyes that seemed to be operating several seconds ahead of whatever his face was showing. He was quiet in the way that children become quiet when they have learned that drawing attention is usually more expensive than the benefits. He observed, he calculated, he learned very early that the world ran on information, who had it, who didn't, and how the gap between those 2 groups determined almost everything. He had been 9 years old when everything changed. 9 years old the first time the city tried to swallow him whole. He had been separated from Mama Bisi's household during a chaotic period, a dispute about property, neighbors forced to relocate, the kind of upheaval that happens constantly in informal settlements and is never reported anywhere and is never resolved in favor of the people who have the least. He had been for approximately 3 weeks genuinely lost. Not lost in the way you get lost in a shopping mall, but lost in the way that means you are sleeping in doorways and eating whatever you can find, and understanding with a clarity that no 9-year-old should have access to, that the city does not care about you. The city does not see you. You can disappear, and nothing will officially register your disappearance because you were never officially registered as being present in the first place. It was during those 3 weeks that he met her. He did not know her name at first. He just knew that she was there,
A girl, maybe 8 or 9, with a fierce, defiant way of holding her chin up that seemed architecturally impossible given how thin and obviously underfed she was. She had found him crying in an alleyway in the late afternoon, that specific hour when the light turns gold and makes even Makoko look like somewhere else, and she had crouched down in front of him with the unsentimental practicality of a child who had long since used up her own store of tears. "Why are you crying?" she asked. "I'm hungry," he said, which was true, but not the whole truth. The whole truth was that he was terrified and alone and 9 years old, and the world felt like a closing fist. But hungry was the part he could say. She had reached into the pocket of her dress, a faded yellow dress, patched at the elbow, far too light for the evening, and produced half a boiled groundnut wrapped in newspaper. She held it out to him without ceremony, without making it a gift that required gratitude to be performed. "Eat it," she said. "There's not more, but it's enough for now." Her name, he learned, was Zainab, and she had a birthmark on her wrist, a jagged 5-pointed star, stark and distinct, that she showed him one afternoon with a defiance she clearly manufactured to cover whatever vulnerability the showing of it actually cost her. "They say it's ugly," she told him. "I think it looks like a star. Stars don't care if people think they're ugly. They shine anyway." He looked at that mark and thought it was the most interesting thing he had ever seen. For almost 4 months they were inseparable. In the brutal ecology of street children, they formed a 2-person alliance that was worth more than its small size suggested. She was fierce in ways that surprised people who only looked at her size. She had a tongue like a machete and absolutely no fear of deploying it, and she had twice physically interposed herself between Kelechi and older boys who had decided his pocket contained things worth taking. She was bolder than he. He was more patient. He could figure out which vendors might have leftover food at the end of the market day. She could talk those same vendors into handing it over. They worked. They talked about everything and nothing, the way children do when they don't yet have the framework to protect themselves from honesty. They talked about what they wanted. Kelechi wanted to build something big enough that the city would have to look at it, and therefore, by extension, at him. Zainab wanted to find her mother, who she believed was still alive somewhere, searching. She wanted to stop moving. She wanted a door that locked, a space that was hers. "We'll find it," he told her once, with the absolute conviction that only a 9-year-old operating on an empty stomach can muster. "We'll get all of it. I'm going to build something big enough that it has rooms for both of us." She laughed, a full, surprised laugh, the kind that children produce before they learn to be careful with their joy. "You don't even have shoes," she pointed out. "Not now," he agreed, "but I will." Then the city services arrived. It was a Thursday. He remembered that specifically, the way you remember the small, irrelevant details of enormous events. A social welfare officer and 2 police officers and a van doing a sweep through the area after a complaint, and suddenly there were hands on his arm and forms being filled out, and someone speaking over his head to someone else about shelters and intake procedures and where there was space. He tried to find her in the confusion, turned, searched, called her name, but the crowd was chaotic, and the hands on his arm were firm, and the van door closed, and she was gone. He shouted her name. Nobody cared. The van drove away. He spent the next 3 years in the state welfare system, 2 different group homes, one with a reasonably decent administrator and one with the opposite. He ran away from the second one when he was 12, made it back to Lagos proper, and began the long, grinding, ferocious ascent that would eventually produce Kelechi Okafor, cover of Forbes Africa, 4 times. But he never stopped looking for the star mark. He had descriptions written. He had search firms hired when he eventually had money to hire search firms. He had investigators comb through welfare records that were, more often than not, incomplete or lost or never properly kept in the first place. He had made inquiries that went nowhere, followed leads that dissolved, spent money on searches that returned nothing. He never told anyone why, really, not the full story. His PR team knew he occasionally supported welfare reform initiatives, which they packaged as corporate social responsibility, and which was true as far as it went, but did not go far enough to be the whole truth. The whole truth was that he was still looking for a fierce little girl with a star on her wrist, because she was the only person who had ever, in the most literal and metaphorical sense, given him something to eat when he had nothing, and he had never figured out how to balance that debt. He had bought a lot of things with his money over the years. He had bought companies and properties and artworks and a level of security so comprehensive that vulnerability had become theoretically impossible. He had bought himself a different life so completely that the boy in the Makoko alleyway was almost recognizable in the man people saw in boardrooms. But he had not bought peace, and he had not found her. And then on an ordinary Thursday afternoon, in the middle of a merger meeting worth 800 million naira, a clumsy maid spilled coffee on his suit. The morning of the merger had begun the way most mornings at the Okafor estate began, with the low, efficient hum of a household operating at the peak of its organizational discipline. By 5:30 a.m., the kitchen staff was already active. By 6, the groundskeepers had completed their first sweep of the gardens. By 7, the breakfast service for Mr. Okafor's personal consumption had been prepared and tested. Temperature, presentation, and dietary compliance.
"I remember, Kelechi," she said. "I don't know when I understood you were the same person." She looked at him, this man in his ruined suit, this empire builder who had just knelt and spilled coffee in front of his entire board, this boy she had once given half a groundnut to in an alleyway that the city had long since swallowed. "But I know it now." He reached across the table, not grabbing, not taking, an offering, his hand open, palm up, extended toward her, and after a moment that felt like the held breath of the entire room, she placed her right hand in his, the marked wrist face up, the star birthmark aligned with the light. "I need to tell you something," he said. "What?" "You said once, in Makoko, you were talking about the birthmark. You said people called it ugly." His thumb moved over the star. "You said stars don't care if people think they're ugly. They shine anyway." He looked up. "I have thought about that sentence every single time I was about to give up on something. Every time. For 25 years, that sentence was the thing I used when I needed to keep going." A pause. "You were 8 years old." Zainab looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "I'm 23 and I still need to remind myself of that." And he laughed. It was a real laugh, surprised out of him, unguarded, reaching his eyes, reshaping his entire face into something younger and more recognizable. It was the laugh of the boy in the alleyway, the one who had cried and then been embarrassed about it, the one who had names for every market vendor and plans for everything. It lasted only a few seconds, but it was real. "Tell me what you need," he said when it had faded. She blinked. "What?" "Not what you think I'm offering, not what you think you're supposed to say. Tell me what you actually need, what would change things for you, what you've been working toward." Nobody had ever asked her that question. Not like that, not with the direct transactional seriousness of someone who is asking because they intend to act on the answer, not because they want the gratification of the asking. She thought about it carefully. Then she told him. The truth of what followed in the weeks and months after the boardroom was not a fairy tale in the classical sense. It was not a story about a poor girl who found a rich man and was rescued into his world. That was not the story, and it was not what either of them wanted.
What it was more complicated and also more beautiful than that. Kelechi had a meeting with his chief of staff within 48 hours of the boardroom incident, not to discuss the merger, which had been rescheduled and was proceeding on track, but to discuss something else. He wanted to establish a scholarship fund, specifically a fund for young women from informal settlements who had demonstrated the kind of disciplined, directed ambition that created people like Zainab, people who had been working 3 jobs since they were teenagers, who had built savings on salaries that most people would consider impossible to save from, who had the intellectual capability and the work ethic, but not the access. The fund would be called the Amira Foundation. He had asked Zainab what her mother's name was, and she had told him, and he had not explained what he was going to do with the information, and when she found out, she had needed to sit down. He also had a second meeting with the HR director of Okafor about a position that was becoming available, a junior management role in the company's operations division, exactly the kind of entry-level corporate position that people with Zainab's organizational intelligence typically arrived at through university degrees they never had access to. He outlined what he needed in a candidate: specific skills, specific personal qualities, and almost supernatural ability to anticipate logistical problems before they became crises, a track record of operating with precision and reliability under pressure. He asked the HR director to identify candidates from non-traditional backgrounds. He did not mention Zainab. He did not have to. She applied through the proper process 3 weeks later, having spent those weeks studying with the focus of someone who has been given a door and has approximately 0 intention of not walking through it. She had always had a mind like that, systematic, absorbent, able to organize large amounts of information into actionable frameworks. She had never had the context to apply it to formal work. Given the context, she was, in the words of the HR director, who did not know the backstory and was working entirely from the assessment process, one of the most impressive candidates I have interviewed in 6 years in this role. She got the job. She did not move into the Okafor estate as a member of the household. That was not the story they were writing. She found an apartment on the mainland, a real one, hers, with her own key and her own furniture that she had selected, and a view of nothing in particular, but a view nonetheless. She was careful, as she had always been careful, about what she allowed herself to feel before she had earned the right to feel it. What she and Kelechi were building between them was not a romance exactly, though it would eventually be that too, not for a long time. Not before trust had been constructed with the kind of slow, unglamorous work that trust actually requires. It was first something rarer and in many ways more important, a friendship between 2 people who recognized each other, who had been shaped by the same streets and the same losses and the same particular quality of resilience that comes from surviving a childhood that did not prioritize your survival. They had dinners. Actual dinners, not performances, in restaurants where they sat across from each other and talked the way they had talked in the alleyway, about everything and nothing, about what they wanted and what they remembered and what they were afraid of and what they were building. He told her things about his company that he hadn't told his board. She told him things about her childhood that she hadn't told anyone, things she had never had anyone safe enough to tell. She was not easy on him. This was perhaps the thing that surprised him most. He had lived for a long time with the version of himself that people were afraid of, the corporate titan version, the invincible version. She saw through it with an ease that was not comfortable, but was exactly what he needed. The ease of someone who knew him before the empire, who knew him when he had nothing, and therefore knew that the empire was not the most real thing about him. She argued with him. She was, when the situation warranted, exactly as fierce as she had been 8 years old in a yellow dress in Makoko. She was not impressed by his money in a way that made her careless about her own growth. She refused things he offered that she felt weren't right yet, and she asked for things she needed without embarrassment, and she worked at Okafor with a seriousness that earned the respect of people who had no idea who she was to the founder. There was one evening, about 4 months after the boardroom incident, when they were sitting on the balcony of his Banana Island mansion. She had come for a dinner that the chef had prepared, and neither of them had been in a hurry to end the evening, and the Lagos lagoon was catching the light late in that specific way it does some evenings, gold and wide and almost unbearably beautiful. He said, "I spent 25 years building something big enough to find you in." She said, "I spent 25 years learning to survive so I'd still be here to be found." And then they sat with that for a while, like you sit with something that is finally resolved, something that has been held in suspension for so long that the resolution itself requires time to fully land. The city spread out below them, loud and relentless and enormous, the city that had taken both of them and lost them, and eventually, after 25 years of a man with enough money and will to keep demanding answers, given them back to each other. She was wearing a deep indigo Ankara gown. She had begun to wear the colors that had always suited her once she had the income to buy clothes that were actually hers. The silver thread in the fabric caught the last of the sun. The star birthmark was visible at her wrist, uncovered, unashamed. She had stopped pulling her sleeve down. There is a particular kind of violence that poverty does to people that doesn't get discussed enough, because it is quieter than the other kinds. It teaches you to make yourself small. It teaches you that your needs are excessive, your presence is an imposition, your desires are a luxury that others, more deserving, more legitimate, more seen, have first claim to. It teaches you to hide the things about yourself that are different, because different, in a world where resources are scarce, invites targeting. It teaches you that the best protection is invisibility. Zainab had carried this teaching in the pulled-down sleeve for 13 months at the Okafor estate. She had carried it for years before that in the careful smallness of herself in other people's homes, in the relentless work ethic that was also, underneath its productivity, a constant performance of worthiness, a perpetual argument to the universe that she had a right to the space she was occupying. The birthmark had become the symbol of everything she had been told to hide, her difference, her distinctiveness, the things about her that didn't fit the requirements of invisibility. She had learned over the years to frame it as protective camouflage rather than shame. Stars don't care if people think they're ugly. They shine anyway.
The city roared on outside the window. Lagos in the afternoon, relentless and loud and alive. A city that had taken so much from both of them, and in the end given them back to each other in the same spillage of dark coffee and morning light. Somewhere across the lagoon, Kelechi Okafor was in a meeting that would determine the next quarter's earnings for 11,000 employees, doing what he did, being what he had made himself into, carrying in the breast pocket of his newest bespoke suit a folded photograph of a yellow dress and a star-shaped mark that he had hand-drawn from memory 25 years ago, so he would recognize it if he ever found it. He had always known he would find it. He just hadn't known it would be while ruining a suit. Destiny has a brilliant sense of timing and an even better sense of humor. A spilled drink wasn't a disaster. It was the exact collision required to heal a lifetime of separation. The universe, tired of subtlety, deciding that the moment had come and arranging the variables accordingly. What you carry as your deepest flaw might be the most specific, irreplaceable thing about you. What you have been hiding might be exactly the map that someone else has been following for decades. What you have survived might be the precise preparation for what comes next. And sometimes, not always, not without effort, not without the long, grinding work of becoming who you are meant to be, sometimes the thing that finds you is worth every year you spent becoming ready to be found. To the Zainabs, keep the sleeve up. To the Kelechis, keep building, keep looking, keep the promise. And to both, the city is large, but it is not infinite. If you keep moving,
If you stay who you are, if you refuse to be made smaller, you will find your way back to each other. Or the coffee will spill. Either way. If this story held you from the first drop of coffee to the last breath of Lagos light, hit that like button and subscribe. Every single day we bring you stories from the continent that are too beautiful, too true, and too powerful to be left untold. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. We'll see you in the next one.